Grabbing a coffee has never been more interesting, especially so if we know we're not grabbing a coffee and having conversations between ourselves. That's Raymond and I, Simon Kasiate. Welcome to the 6th edition of Grab a Coffee, where we brew some bold conversations on politics, society, and yes, critical thinking, especially that last one, which is becoming a reality in our real time as it is. First, we need to apologize for not coming through last week, as should have been the case, where Raymond thought for the most part that no one would notice. Oh, woe betide, how wrong we were. That many of you reached out and said, there is no episode this week. What are you guys doing? So we must apologize for not coming through. We had both physical and technical glitches that never made it possible for us to come through. I was away out of location, which is no excuse because we could have done this remotely. Sadly, Raymond was in a place where he couldn't have come through remotely. He was in a basement learning a new language. He'll be telling us details about it. But welcome to this edition where we're going to have a good conversation on the week that was, the week that we see ahead of us, and everything in between. Welcome to the program, Raymond.
Thank you so much, Simon. Why didn't you tell people you were in Nairobi and that Nairobi was turning on its head? You know, you caused the resignation of a deputy president there from his party. You know,
I'm always there when certain things happen that I do not be associated with my presence in that place, including the fact that I was there just before Christmas when the Ugandan opposition leader, Kizza Besigye,
was detained. Oh yes.
So I picked it up from the news and I was there and I said, how did this happen all below my nose? I had nothing to do with it.
So it was a very complex week. It was a really complex week.
But it started off with a court in Kenya pronouncing itself on the fact that this man should actually be the vice president in Kenya. Forget about whatever happened.
That was a very complex case. When I first saw it, I think that the argument the court made was that the court wasn't properly constituted when they booted him out.
Exactly.
So now there are some interpretations around what does that actually mean.
Appeal, right?
Yes, we're waiting to find out what that actually means. But our people need to know that we tried to record this podcast almost 3 times over. We tried on Wednesday, failed, moved into Thursday, failed, attempted on Friday.
To do a live one.
Yes, a live one, and failed. So it's not for a lack of not trying. We tried.
Let's say that whereas that could have been the reasons as why we didn't come through, we are simply putting it to our vast majority of followers that then this will be the last time they will hear such extra.
Never again. We'll now be recording on the go.
Absolutely. And so that said, let's dive in really quick and fast and start with how well our weeks have been.
My week has been slightly longer, like you might have noted. Of course, there's a lot that's happening. Uganda Airlines will be flying to London for the first time this week.
This weekend.
That's something I'm looking forward to.
Are you on that first maiden flight? Or
I am not. I am not on the maiden flight. I know a couple of friends who are. I'm running a fundraiser for the Uganda Cancer Children's Foundation.
You have really run that to the highest heavens and the lowest.
I need a kit from you, Simon, so please.
I mean, many people that I know that know you are so afraid of opening their X feeds just in case you've tagged them for. So,
but my friends have been very generous, so we've been able to raise some money. And so I've been dedicating my days to that, doing some work in the foreign policy space and then doing some work around this fundraiser. And the run, of course, is on Sunday. So if you're listening to this on Friday, please buy a kit, show up on Sunday and run with us. We're trying to build a patient hostel for cancer children that are being treated at Mulago.
Until someone comes through and says marathons in this town are outrunning every other kind of event from...
Ugandans talk. That's the thing. Ugandans were good at talking. We're really good at talking. What did you do with your week, though?
Well, pretty much of a lot of stuff that's under the radar in terms of my usual engagements in the work that I do, which is, having conversations around public affairs, corporate communication, sustainability discussions with the different clients that I meet, but also most importantly, taking time off to really reflect and also as has always been the case, at least in the last several months, getting closer to my God. I talk about getting closer to my God. The last time we spoke, the conclave was just opening its doors to allowing the cardinals.
Yes.
And now we speak on the dawn of a new pope, an interesting person.
Did you see his Twitter account? He opened a new Twitter account yesterday and set off with flames.
Absolutely.
I love the energy that he has come with.
Well, the Vatican had warned us to say he is going to operate from X and he is not going to Instagram, and the world will be taken up by whatever. And then, of course, we were all picked up with the euphoria of the fact that how do we know him? The Kenyans were showing us, video and photographic evidence of him having been to Kenya, I think 2 times earlier. First as a priest, the next time as a bishop, so they're expecting to see him there as a pontiff. And then there was this conversation around him having been a chaplain in your backyard. Is that true?
I have been arguing with people about this. I don't think that story is true. So there's a picture of him that shows something looks like a hostel at Chegove. But there's no record of him from Chegove or outside of Chegove, of him being there. So we don't know if he was a chaplain at St. Leo's, but I've tried asking.
Maybe it's the coloration of him having chosen the name Pope Leo the 16th and then St. Leo's.
Very likely then, very likely.
Because even in the picture, anyone can tell that he looks as he is today, as opposed to how he would have looked like in 1987 when it's alleged that he was.
Yeah, so we are also waiting for I think the Vatican is going to release a list of places where he's been, what is called the substantive profile. Then we can read from the substantive profile.
St. Leo's is just in our backyard. We can always find out from them who is, and that now brings me to the conversation.
My good Bishop Muhirwa would have
keeping records in Ugandan spaces. I tell people once in a while that I still have my high school uniform, and they frown at me and say, "Simon, you're such a hoarder." But those are the things that you hold on to that then tell the story. There will be a time when there is no other evidence that I was in a particular school at any one time, except the fact that I have that uniform and maybe a colorating picture of me wearing that uniform. And then there has to be the forensics of proving whether the uniform in the picture is the actual uniform that I have. So
it's a very difficult conversation. But I honestly don't think that he was at St. Leo's Chegove. If he was, the Catholic Church there is very well organized. At least from Virika, which is very few minutes from Chegove, they would have communicated by now that the Pope used to live in Chegove as a chaplain.
Without a doubt.
Yes.
So,
but Toro has been known to have so many white chaplains before. So it's also not off the cards completely. We're just waiting for the officialdom to show up.
Raymond, what does Uganda Airlines dropping into London, Gatwick, as a direct flight and 4 times a week mean in terms of opening up our country? Not even so much about tourism, but the fact that you can have breakfast in Uganda and dinner at the Shard in London.
It's a validly, as a person that occasionally goes to London, it's something that's looked forward to, because traditionally now what we've had to do is either you go to Rwanda and fly from Rwanda into London Heathrow.
Or Nairobi.
Yes, or you go to Nairobi and fly from Nairobi into Gatwick. Both of those have longer wait times. Or you could fly from with KLM from here to Brussels, then from Brussels to London. A direct flight, of course.
Addis?
Yes,
London.
That one I've never done.
London. I've
never done Addis.
I've done Dubai.
Yes.
London.
So this is going to be shocking. I was in Uganda in January, and the doctoral committee in our department decided to put a meeting on the next day in the morning, and I saw that email very late. So I had to look for the quickest flight to get to London and be in Oxford in time for it. I then discovered that Qatar Airways is the quickest flight. So I flew Qatar, went to Doha, waited in Doha for 1 hour, and then took off from Doha into London. And I showed up for the committee meeting.
Quite very interesting. Well, while we have the euphoria of now finally opening our skies and, letting people coming in quicker times and both ways, what about the question around our efficiencies? I mean, yes, we know that when we set the skies and had our national carrier back online, the euphoria was high, and then we started to go back into the Ugandanese challenges that bedevil our service provision, delayed flights. The fact that sometimes the carriers themselves may not be on schedule for reasons that are beyond Uganda Airlines as a organization. We can stand being embarrassed in the region and say, okay, fine, the scheduled flight to Nairobi for 6 p.m. has been pushed to 8 p.m. for reasons they possibly don't tell you until after the flight. Are we ready to serve that kind of embarrassment to a transcontinental flight such as...
I think that's a conversation that the Uganda Airlines is going to have consistently. Many of the flights that go into Gatwick, of course, are traditionally African airlines, whether it's Ethiopian Airlines, Kenya Airways, and they've had their own challenges getting into Gatwick. What I think that the Uganda Airlines needs to tap into is that London is the financial hub of the world.
True.
And because of being the financial hub of the world, there are lots of people who run businesses that have their registered LLCs in London, who now will have a new look at the way they invest in the region. And because of that new look, they will start to look at this airline as a potential go-between, that they can be in Kampala and they can be in London. And those are people that you need to tap into. About operative efficiency, those are minor details that the airlines need to handle.
You call them minor because indeed they should be minor.
Yeah.
But for the most part, they tend to be the majors when everything else is right. And then we fail on the small little, what you call minor things. Yeah. Because you see, for an investor who has a meeting at Canary Wharf and has to make it on time and you delay them by even 45 minutes, that can make a whole difference on whether they choose you next time or not.
Exactly. First of all, I'm giving them benefit of doubt because the aircraft that's going on that line is new aircraft. So I don't expect, for example, that the aircraft that's going to be flown into Gatwick is the same aircraft that's going to do the regional tours. So that's the Bombardiers are for the regional tours, the longer haul is the Boeing.
So those won't be interfered by, say, a presidential visit to a neighboring country and they say, come on the Gulf Stream.
Highly unlikely. Highly unlikely. But I think that the Uganda Airlines needs to realize that operative efficiency goes into people's choices. Many of us who occasionally do the flying know, for example, that there's a time when you choose KLM. It's the most expensive flight, but you choose it simply because you can't mess up the meeting times.
Absolutely.
And you know that you will be there on time, come rain, come sunshine. Other times you choose Kenya Airways for very specific routes.
For if example, you have the latitude of time and say, okay, even if they delay, as they always may.
Yes, but Kenya Airways has its problems, but the morning 6 a.m. flight from here to Nairobi, that has never been tampered with. So if you need to get into Nairobi very early in the morning, they're the perfect choice, yes. So those operative efficiencies, Uganda Airlines needs to know that they sit in the business of the airline.
Let's get to conversations that are possibly close at the majority of our hearts, which is the possibility that you, Raymond, donning nice ceremonial black shoes, could actually end up in the court-martial.
Kaunda suit too.
Kaunda suit with certain buttons, or even for that matter, a cape that has green on it like the one I am donning, even though the label is an Under Armour one. Yeah. You could end up in the court-martial. Why? Because some of this wear has been gazetted in the new UPDF amendment bill as exclusive military store. That's one aspect of looking at the amendment currently before Parliament. Or should we say, as we speak today, which is a Friday, it possibly has already seen the light of day as a bill waiting for assent of the President and Commander-in-Chief. Or even worse still, questions abound as to the out-of-this-world efficiency with which this bill is being tackled. We've not known Parliament to move at such supersonic speed.
Operative efficiency.
Operative efficiency.
Well, the Rocco bailout was quicker.
But the Rocco bailout didn't require...
Started in the morning, ended in the evening. Rocco had the money by the morning.
But they require the public to weigh in on whether or not. But this does require the public to come in. It requires certain institutional organizations such as the Law Society, such as political parties and other different stakeholders, but in groups to weigh in. But when people are beginning to show evidence of the fact that they received an invitation to speak to the committee at 5 p.m. to show up the next day at 9 a.m., that's marks of ill will and a bit of sneaky behavior that weighs in heavily on the legitimacy of these amendments, if at all they see the light.
My friends at ULS received theirs at 11:50 and they were required at Parliament at midday. So they had 10 minutes within which they received to show up. But
well prepared.
yes,
representation.
but Simon, I think that our audience would, of course, there are those smaller tactical problems, but we need to talk about the larger strategic problem now, which is that the role of the military in Uganda's politics, even the efficiency you're seeing within the Ugandan parliament. Oftentimes, we have pretended as though the military, in the liberal constitution we drafted in 1995, we have pretended as though that the military is an outsider in the politics of Uganda.
Which was a huge oversight or possibly an outright mistake to imagine.
Yes. I spent some time, for example, reading Apollo Makuya's book and realized this is not just a UPDF problem. The King's African Rifles, when they arrived here, people need to know this, they stationed their troops outside of Buganda and asked Buganda if Buganda would sign an agreement. That was the Buganda agreement. So it was you either sign or we march in with troops. After they had conquered Buganda, they moved to Bunyoro. After Bunyoro, they added My Kingdom Toro, and after Toro, they added Ankole. So that's how Uganda was constructed, that there was this internecine force seated on the outside, which was a threat to the peace of civilians. And civilian authority, in this case the kings, realizing that a face-off with armed guards may not be the best outcome. So I fear that that legacy hasn't gone away. When you hear in our history, for example, that the Kabalega was exiled to Seychelles for long periods, died from exile. And you also then hear that all living presidents of Uganda died in exile. That tells you that this is something that's systemic.
And that there has not been any change of guard, political guard in this country over the last over 50 years of our independence that has not had the military clearly involved. Except our quest for independence.
Yes, that tells you a little bit about the kind of society that we live in. It tells you also a grand deal about the kind of politics we have. In 1995 was the first time we were looking forward and being aspirational. But being aspirational doesn't negate the realities of the day.
As they say,
yes, the realities of the day are that what we have before our eyes right now is that the military has a lot more power than our civilian authority. And they are the final arbiters because they use violence. And because
which is their exclusive module.
Yes, and they have a monopoly on it. So now, if anyone wants to challenge them militarily, that's the only path within which you can undo the order. But I am skeptical now about whether this order will stand. I'm skeptical about whether this order will survive. I'm also skeptical about this continued fight between the politics and the military of the country. We've presented it as a matter that cannot be solved. We've presented it as a matter that requires conflict between the military and civilian authority, that the only way is for them to fight each other, and the winner of the day is the one that takes the day.
One may need to look at it from this other perspective, that if you look at the youngest and sadly the biggest opposition political group, away from what other political groups in the opposition have behaved like, at least in the time when I've been an active male adult, the FDC did not have foot soldiers, so to speak. I have not heard of foot soldiers belonging to the Democratic Party. The UPC had youth wingers, but they were not foot soldiers as we know them. But for the current opposition group called National Unity Platform, having foot soldiers mimicking the UPDF in terms of dress and other forms of regalia, except for having military wear in terms of arsenal. That plays into what you just said, that now people look at the fact that for you to gain, even if you're aspiring for civilian political leadership, you must be seen to have a certain militant disposition around you for you to square up with the status quo.
Yeah, so the classes in Uganda, for example, the property class in Uganda relies a lot on the violent factions of the state to enforce their rights. If you have a piece of land, you have the number of the DPC, genuinely. Not because the DPC is the one who is stronger than the Uganda Land Commission, not because he's the district land board, but because you know that if you call the DPC to send police officers to stop someone from grabbing your land, that they will do that. And I think that we've now come to that point where are we going to meet the aspirations that the 1995 Constitution set out with? because those aspirations were that you can be a civilian, you can express yourself the way you want. If you want to express yourself as a foot soldier, the politics of the day should allow you to express yourself as a foot soldier. Now, for me, the bigger worry is that the King's African Rifles collapsed as an army. The Uganda army collapsed as an army. UNLF collapsed as an army. UPDF can collapse as an army. But together with the collapse of those armies came the collapse of the political class too. So King's African Rifles collapsed, but the Ugandan state that came with it, the British colonial government, also collapsed. The Obote government was taken over in a coup d'etat by the Ugandan army. And Idi Amin, on his way out, also the army then was collapsed. So the collapse of the army often comes with the collapse of the political order too.
Why? Because they're intertwined. It's one and the same.
Yes, and it behooves our political class and our military class to realize the people who are not speaking in this debate, who should be in this debate.
E.g.?
The wealth class of this country. So think the large Indian manufacturers, think the kingdoms, think the young and emerging elites and bureaucrats in civil government. Those are people that you need to ask more intently. Those are people that you need to listen to. Also, the UPDF needs to realize that as a political army, there are things that require of you to understand. Because you're not just an enforcer of the state, you're also a guarantor of the state.
Raymond, I think without losing our listeners, we are speaking too much English, if I put it that.
Yes.
Let's ask ourselves and pose it around the fact that you have this amendment to the UPDF Act. To what end? What is the emergency of it being amended now in such a manner? What are we trying to avert so quickly? Maybe for our audience to follow and understand why now, why this?
Yeah. So
is it because we have civilian political threats to the status quo that need to be tightened further into the corner of muzzlement that we put them through so that we can try them in a military court where there is little recourse to justice, as it were?
Well, that's one way to look at it. The other second way to look at it is that after 1995, we had 1996 elections. After 96, we had 2001 elections. The 2001 elections are the ones that ushered in Colonel Dr. Kizza Besigye as an opponent. And he was such an opponent and a threat because he had come from the inside. Yes. And he was a former member of the UPDF.
Not just that, but the chief political commissar.
Commissar of the UPDF, yes. So the UPDF wasn't just a military outfit, it was also a political outfit. So there was a political side to it. And remember, from all the way from 86, political party activity had been banned. So the only way to express yourself politically was through this movement system. Up until we had a referendum and allowed political parties to participate. Now, in aspirational, we wanted the political parties to operate. But in reality, we didn't want those political parties to even move an inch. So the FDC, for example, has been meted upon some of the worst civil violence you can see. Colonel Kizza has been detained, tried, charged with all manner of cases. So you have military violence which is used in political campaigning, which then limits the political options and alternatives available to the opposition.
So to put this plainly, Raymond, what you're simply saying in all this very wonderful English is this amendment bill is really so much about sustaining the current political status quo.
I wouldn't reduce it to that. And I struggle. I feel like if we reduce it to that, then we lose the bigger debate. The bigger debate is, what is the place and role of a military in the political dispensation of Uganda? Can we have open political contestation that doesn't wish away the state of Uganda? And that's the thing to ask the UPDF leadership. Why don't the soldiers believe that civil and civilian courts are capable of handling any matter that is affecting of the state, basic state stability? If you say that Colonel Dr. Kizza Besigye committed treason, bring him to the High Court. Why don't you believe that the High Court, which has all these fantastic judges, why don't you believe that if you take your evidence there, that they will convict him? So that's the contestation you have at the heart of this.
In my earlier days, of course, when we were covering the contestations of Dr. Kizza Besigye and others, it was the first time I came face to face with the word double jeopardy. I remember the time Dr. Kizza Besigye was facing charges in the court martial, and the same charges were being replicated in the High Court.
In the High Court, yes.
In the High Court. And so the man was attending to two different jurisdictions,
yes,
but facing the same.
So Besigye represents the contestation between Uganda's civilian life and military life. And now the emergence of younger, angrier opposition has just escalated that. And so the reason why I say we shouldn't reduce that debate is because there are many examples of states where you think that this contestation can be simply resolved by saying, let's have civilian authority over military authority. And then next thing you know, you have military dictatorships that are prolonged, like Egypt. Yes. Or you can have civilian authority win the day over the military, like Sudan, and then you have state breakdown immediately.
And a resurgence of military.
So it's not a conversation that you just approach very easily. And I appreciate the silence of the wealthy elite. I appreciate the silence of the powerful people in the country, because the reason they are silent is to try and sort of get a diplomatic outcome out of this. Well, realizing that... No, first of all, the military has its own public relations crisis at the moment. That public relations crisis is not helping the matter at the moment. But genuinely and validly so, if we went down to the reality of it, if the military chose to push through that amendment through the Parliament of Uganda, you have an election that's coming up just 8 months down the road. Every member of parliament knows the role of the military in guaranteeing the election victory in their constituency. They are not going to vote with civilian authority. They're really not going to vote with civilian authority.
So it's not even an NRM thing. It's going to be, for any reason, it has to be by partisanship.
Yes, if we have this contest as a show of force, we know who the winner is going to be. Right. But if this contest moves into a show of intellect, the winner will become the civilians, because the UPDF needs to realize that you've guaranteed basic state structure that allows for civilian contestation. Now, in the realm of civilian contestation, one of the people in there is your founding father, who is Yoweri Kaguta Museveni. You need to see him when he contests as a civilian, not as your founding father. Now, if the UPDF can't detach that from our political contestation, then they're headed in much the same way King's African Rifles, Uganda Army, UNLA ended up.
Well, you're speaking about the UPDF as if it's one homogeneous army, so to speak, but you know that there have been bubbling sentiments around another army that's perhaps more well-funded, better trained, well-motivated, called the Special Forces Command, SFC. And in this amendment, we are seeing a clause that brings what were otherwise, which started off as a brigade, it grew into something bigger than a brigade, and now, from the amendments being proposed, which will pass and see the light of day, the SFC is going to come in at a level that is at the same level with, say, the land forces, which will further entrench the bubbling sentiments that we've had. We may not be able to put a finger to ascertain the validity of that claim. The fact that we see the UPDF developing fault lines along the fact that the SFC is a more elite group, perhaps whose membership is picked not from a national outlook, that you find majority of them seem to come from one particular area. They are better trained, more facilitated. And don't you think that threatens the unity and the fact that you can talk about UPDF as a bloc?
So again, that debate, honestly, the Navy SEALs in the US are the equivalent of the Special Forces here. They are a division on their own. They might operate with the US Army. They might come as a complementary effort to the US Army, but they operate as a division of their own. And that's a more robust and advanced democracy. The Green Berets in the UK are a division of their own too. They are the Special Forces of the UK. They operate outside of the army. They might have complementary rules. So they all salute one head of the army. They don't salute their division heads. They salute one head of the army. And in this case, we have a PR crisis because the head of the army at the moment is also the son of the president. But take away him as the son of the president and replace the head of the army with, say, Waiswa Mufumbiro, who becomes the CDF. Because we have individuals and the PR crisis of individuals, we neglect the institutions. The in truth, the UPDF has grown as a fighting force. And I might speak with a little bias because I've seen them on the fighting fronts. They've grown as a fighting force, and the complementary efforts as a fighting force are different. The Air Force, which is a division of the army, for example, operates in their own realm. They sit in Entebbe. But the CDF can call upon them and say, we have a mission in Juba. We need you on these coordinates to find out for us if there are ammunitions there. Now, the Air Force, when they get that command from the CDF, they don't go back to interpret it. Is this something we should take or not? They do it because they're a complementary force. But there are things within the Air Force which a land forces commander will not understand. For example, the Air Force, people say SFC is the most elite, but the Air Force is the most elite force in Uganda's army. The people who are there are mathematicians, they're scientists, they are degree holders, master's holders, many of them. And anywhere in the world that you meet an elite force, that's why it's called an elite force. It must be able to interpret circumstances.
So we shouldn't narrow down this whole thing.
Yes.
Looking at it, we're trying to analyze the fault lines from...
We have the public relations crisis that the UPDF has, and we have the biases that come with that. But those biases should not take away the fact that all around us, countries have advanced their armies. Kenya has a Special Forces Command. Rwanda has a Special Forces Command, the Presidential Guard. Tanzania has a Special Forces Command. Kenya, in fact, even has a Navy now.
Absolutely.
Which acts independent of the army. So how do you expect this small landmass country, which is landlocked, whose forces have been fighting and have out-of-area expertise for more than 3 decades, how do you expect them to operate as the same institution over and over? I mean, you have a small institution like the Daily Monitor. Over time, the Daily Monitor has grown into the T-Vibe, it's grown into different segments. You now have an online entity because you respond to what's happening in the market. So the army is also responding to what's happening. So the thing is, again, this is why I said, because I am biased because I've reported on the army for so long, and I've also looked at other armies. So for me, it's easy to interpret it as a typical military story. There are some things in the UPDF amendment which, honestly, the UPDF should be left as an institution to handle on their own. That's their bill, they should handle it. There are matters where they interact with the civilian authority where we genuinely must have a conversation on where does this army stop within the realm of civilian politics.
Like you said rightly, I think the PR crisis within the UPDF and maybe the Ministry of Defense is something that they really need to look seriously into and not go into the area of saying, well, we are the state, we are the army, we don't need PR, the usual
they need it
for government agencies when they're faced with a PR situation, a reputation crisis.
But, Simon, the other thing I will tell you for free is that any army with out-of-area expertise opens itself up for political contestation. Whether it's the US Army, people end up in Congress discussing it. Whether it's the UK Army, people end up in Parliament discussing it. So anytime that you take on any out-of-area operations, you take taxpayers' money, and taxpayers have a genuine cause to ask, what are you doing with our money, where you have gone? So the UPDF also needs to realize that civilians discussing their affairs is because civilians pay their taxes that keep the armies there. But the idea that the army has no role to play in the state, that is the one that
in the politics of the state.
That's the one that I think needs to be done away with. We need to realize and say, okay, this army is a large stakeholder in the politics of the country, but where is the limit? What is your limit in civilian contestation?
If at all.
And yes, and that's the struggle that Kizza Besigye has had. That's the struggle that many opposition politicians have had. We've had the misfortune of having one leader, but it would be nice to see how many other different leaders,
or who's a different,
it would be nice to see how different presidents handle an army. Because
especially one that they did not found.
Yes, because you have an army like the Tanzanian army. People call it a quiet army, but it's the army that has occupied Uganda before for 8 years.
Caused regime change.
Yes, for 8 years. And every president who comes, people say there's more democratic dispensation in Tanzania. Presidents change every 10 years. But right now, Tanzanians tell you Samia Suluhu has made the army a tool in the politics. So that hasn't gone away. Anyone who becomes the commander-in-chief of the armed forces must deal with the fact that this is an institution, and that institution has dues and things they must do in the politics of the country. Now, does that extend to civilian contestation? Maybe not. The UPDF needs to realize that there must be civilian contestation, and if the person who is their founding father is defeated in that civilian contestation, they have to be willing and ready to salute whoever becomes the civilian leader and follow.
You had him, Raymond, speaking very much as the military expert that he is, but that then is supposed to give you the perspective of the fact that you should not reduce the amendment, UPDF amendment bill, to whether or not you're wearing a beret that is regarded as exclusive military wear, or whether or not you
Yes,
are...
but we must mention that the bill is shabbily presented. The bill is very shabbily presented. There are clauses in that bill that needs to be discussed over longer periods of time.
Also, the efficiency.
Yes. This is why I say, as an aspirational Ugandan, you would wish and say, you know what? Can you apply this efficiency to all the other bills? Exactly. That's the aspirational Uganda.
Every other prospect of how we carry out our development, whatever. You have a 21-kilometer road in the city that has been under construction for the last 23 years, meaning for you may do a kilometer for more than a year. But when it comes to these things,
so the contestations between civilian and military relations, if people need to see them, a brigade commander in charge of a division receives more information on a day-to-day basis than the civilian political leaders in that area. They know what the LC5 is doing and not doing. They know who is... Even on road construction projects now, the UPDF actually guards both the fuel units on those road constructions and the equipment.
And the materials, other materials.
Yes, but people forget that this is a hierarchical institution. So every day someone reports all the way upwards. And the division commander knows how much fuel the contractor has on site. So if you negate those realities, you run the risk of slipping us into a military dictatorship over longer periods of time.
As we conclude our conversation today, let's get out of the borders of Uganda and maybe ask ourselves a few questions on how the global, relations are taking shape. We see President Trump going to the Middle East as his maiden foreign trip after his second term in office, which, by the way, draws the same parallels with previously. He, in his first term, the first place he went to still was the Middle East, as opposed to what has been traditionally the first places American presidents go to, which is North to Canada, their neighbor, who now I think they don't see eye to eye, or they go to Mexico, or they go to the UK. But Donald Trump seems to say,
I love this. This is a running thesis on my laptop. Every day I write a new chapter on it.
And so the question that I want to put to you as an international relations expert or someone who really watches the things very closely, Raymond, is Donald Trump's presence in the Middle East and all these deals we're seeing being signed up, 600 billion or trillion US dollars coming in from Saudi Arabia as investments into the US, and we see him, of course, with aspirations to build branded towers and golf resorts and all that. Is it for the American people? It's personal business, or it's a combination of both? I mean, the man is awarded a $400 million jetliner from a government no less than Qatar. Is it coming down to become an Air Force One that will remain for the other presidents as going forward, or is it going to become a Trump Airlines when he finally leaves the White House as a personal gift? And if that were the case, don't the US have certain caps on how big a gift you can receive in your tenure as president, if it's supposed to be seen as one that looks at the American interest as opposed to them twisting you for their own individual interests, both business and political?
I don't know if I want to get into the moral positivities, justifications, and the like. I think the grand strategy is really clear. There is a great power competition happening between the United States and China. It's not going to go away. It's continuing. Every day, China has eclipsed the US as a bigger economy, although nowhere yet near the per capita income of the US. That the nature of this and size of the Chinese economy means that China is also going to have to match that economic power with military might. And the first contestation between China and the US militarily, many people predict, will be when China genuinely takes over Taiwan, because they have...
And also starts putting up military bases in places that are not contestable,
yes,
like the South China Sea, and US has the biggest military base in Qatar, I think, in the region. So when China begins to put those
yes.
installations around the world, then they can say.
But that contestation is because of the order that was handed to the world at the end of the World War II. Every World War produces a new order, and the only way to undo that order is either have a World War, a massive catastrophe. So we've had those two orders, and the order that we've been living in is the liberal international order, to which we keep saying, there is no hegemon here, there's no one who is the police of the other, but there are people who have a higher active participation in that order than others. So the United States, for example, has been behind the Bretton Woods institutions, which have funded many economies. They've been behind the military prowess of many of the world's places. In fact, there is no military that matches the US military. Nowhere in the world have we seen a military like the US military.
In terms of real
scale, scope, size, funding, spending, use. When the World War ended, the United States was an important party in the defeat of the Allies. So in the victory of the Allies. And because of being an important party, it constructed this new world order. And that's we have been living into the US order. That order has come under challenge by countries like China, which say they are part of this order that function, they are part of this order that don't function. Even Africa has had its own contestation. Uganda, for example, we're in the DRC. One of the reasons we're in the DRC is because this order doesn't function.
That's why we've been in Somalia after Black Hawk Down.
Yes. So those contestations over the old order or the current reigning order, but in decline, have made us reach this area where Middle East and Middle Eastern powers are very important, because where they shift their weight to determines who has the power. Yes, the balance of power goes. Now, you need to look at them two ways. Those Middle Eastern powers are economic powers, exceptional economic powers. You look at countries like Qatar, they have a very high per capita income. There is no way they're going to spend that money ever in their lifetime. In fact, countries fight inflation, Qatar fights deflation. Qatar is trying to unfund their government. This is the
so they're looking for places where they have to fund other places.
Yes, and then you have in the Middle East a contestation within those powers themselves. So you have Saudi Arabia, you have Iran, which are in a contestation of their own. You have Qatar, which is in a contestation of its own, which sees the US as a very valuable partner because it's a deterrent factor for all those other countries around it. Yeah. So the arrival of Donald Trump, first of all, was everyone is trying to give him the best welcome possible because they want American might and power. So that is, those middle powers have also decided on behalf of the US without their knowledge and on behalf of China without their knowledge to say, we will interpret continents like Africa for you. So the United Arab Emirates right now has massive investments on the African coastline, massive investments in Africa.
And also we've seen some of these middle powers, as you call them, come down to try and act as arbiters for warring factions in Africa.
Qatar is mediating between
Rwanda and DRC. You saw that picture. I mean, regional blocs could not bring President Kagame and President Tshisekedi in the same room, but the Qatari leader brought them within an arm's distance.
Yes. Because they're the biggest consumers. They've become a logistical hub of the world and the biggest consumers of your product. So they can decide how you behave politically because they own your economies or they dictate the flow of your economies. So those things are important. I saw the former defense minister of Qatar was in Uganda on a private visit to the president. Definitely there's a message that Qatar must have carried and handed over to the president.
About the DRC issue, for example.
The deputy prime minister of the United Arab Emirates was in Uganda just a week before the defense minister of Qatar was here. They must definitely have carried their own message to the president, Yoweri Museveni. So they are repurposing global relations to say the US no longer has to deal with Uganda directly. You can deal with Uganda through Qatar. If you have a problem with them, speak to us. But that also means that the aspirations of these other smaller powers have to change. Your aspirations now have to be, how do you link yourself to the middle powers so that you prosecute your case in the best way possible? And that's where the diplomacy now comes in. Do you want to have a consulate in the United States of America in Washington, where you have no say in where the IMF and the World Bank operates? Or do you want to have
Doha?
4 consulates in the Middle East, where you speak directly with the Emiratis every day and say, we have this contestation, we need your help on this matter, we think you can help with this matter, and they transmit that to the greater power, or they solve it themselves. That's a matter of strategy that we have to decide for ourselves.
But the good thing is we have an ex-officio member of cabinet who is into the space of foreign relations, so I believe that he takes very seriously what we converse about this
I hope he does.
In the last episode, Raymond, we started off a new, very brief segment on the conversation as we grab a coffee and say, what's grabbing a coffee without a book in hand?
Yes.
And so I started off by sharing what I was reading at the moment.
Chisinja.
Exactly, Chisinja. Oh, wow.
You must have enjoyed.
And then things were just playing out in exactly how he wrote many years ago. Yeah. And I'm seeing them play out right in front of me with the visit of President Trump to the Middle East and all these other contestations going on and the conversations that are going to take place, that have taken place in Turkey with Ukraine and Russia. What about you? What are you looking at? I challenge you to find a book and share with us what you're reading.
You don't need to challenge me to books. I've been reading The Big Con. This is the third book of Mariana Mazzucato.
And this time she partners with Rosie Collins.
Yes. She's a typical scholar in government studies, and she's one of the foremost scholars on the state as an entrepreneurial entity. And this book is about how consulting agencies have taken over government's capacity to do basic things.
What do you mean consulting agencies? Are we talking about the likes of McKinsey?
So yes, you sit in Uganda, for example, you have PwC, KPMG, all of those doing work that the government of Uganda should ordinarily be doing. So you're trying to investigate, for example, Crane Bank, and you call in PwC to do that investigation, which should have been done by the CID, which has been done by the Office of the Auditor General. So the biggest case here is against the consulting industry.
Oh, what are they saying? Are they saying what I normally say about consultants? That they take your watch and tell
you the time. No, she makes an even bigger case to say that consulting agencies should be complementary to government efforts, but not replacing government efforts. And she makes a very fantastic case. And I am reading this book because at the Ministry of Finance in Uganda currently is more than 1 trillion shillings that's meant to go out to contractors that hasn't yet gone out. And that's because I think the Ministry of Finance maybe doesn't have the money. Or has
what kind of contractors? Are they consultants or constructors?
So some of them are contractors who are doing road work. Some of them are consultants who've been consulting. But the biggest question of the day is, do you get a consulting agency to help you handle debt repayments? Or do you do that as a government? You know, there's a debt repayment unit inside the Ministry of Finance.
Yeah, but we also hire consultants to handle debt repayment.
Well, the IMF will hire for you a consultant, for example, on debt repayment, and you may not be able to say no to that person.
Because anyway, the IMF is going to pay, and then you pay the IMF.
Yes, so that I'm trying to understand how consultants in Uganda are influencing government activity.
You can see that Raymond is always up to something very interesting. And the reason why we share the books that we are reading at the moment between Raymond and I is to encourage you every so often to pick yourself a book, a read, and get that insight that you possibly wouldn't find in places such as this. But that's not to say do not follow us and subscribe to our Grab a Coffee podcast from wherever you find your podcast.
And we have a big announcement that's going to come for only our subscribers. So if you're not a subscriber, you will not hear it.
As they say in Jamaican patois, big things are going. So if you're not part of this movement, you're going to blink and out you miss. It's been a pleasure having this conversation as you listen in, as you watch, as you join us. Let's keep the dials on till next time when we have another conversation as we grab a coffee. Stay blessed.